Thanks very much, Tom. Let me say first it's a pleasure to be here at Biola. I've been here on previous occasions and had a good time every time, and it's a pleasure to be back. I should say about Tom, he was one of the best students I had in 28 years of teaching grad students at Notre Dame. But I was a little surprised at his sort of approach. I mean, he wanted me to direct his dissertation. It wouldn't be necessary to call me Honey Crock or Alley Baby or anything like that. I mean, that struck me as just a shade over the top. But I suspect not all of you are are majors in philosophy. I know that some people don't major in philosophy. I mean, it's distressing, but there it is. But on second thought, I guess I can see why people don't all major in philosophy. I mean, in some ways, it's sort of a miserable subject. Don't get me wrong, I happen to like it very much myself. But, well, you often have to think about all sort of disgusting things if you want to do philosophy properly. So, for example, you have to, if you do epistemology, theory of knowledge, you have to think about being a brain in a vat. You have to imagine this kind of scenario. You're captured by aliens from some other planet, and they take you back to their home base, and they remove your brain from your skull and put it in a vat of nutrients and keep it artificially alive. And then they attach leads to it, you know, with wires running to their Apple computer, and they type in it what they want you to think and believe and feel and experience, right? Now, if they did that, if that had happened to me, everything would seem exactly the way it does seem, right? So how do I know that isn't happening? That's one kind of thing you have to think about, which is, you know, I think that's a rather unpleasant topic myself. I'm not. Another thing you have to think about is solipsism. So you're a solipsist if you think you are the only thing that exists, everything else being a figment of your imagination, right? So if you're a solipsist, you think nothing exists but you, and everything that looks like it exists is just a figment of your imagination. There have been a few solipsists. Bertrand Russell was a solipsist for a while during his career. I think Bertrand Russell was most anything at one time or another during his career. And in fact, one time a lady, I believe her name was Lady Ladd Franklin, wrote Bertrand Russell a letter and said that she thought he was probably right about solipsism. She agreed that solipsism must be true, and she concluded by saying, I wonder why there aren't more of us, you know, of us solipsists. Well, one time when I was just starting off in philosophy, I actually met a real solipsist. I was at Wayne State University in Detroit, and I heard that there was, in the medical school, a professor who was a solipsist, a genuine, honest-to-goodness solipsist. So I wanted to see what one looked like. I'd never seen one before, so I went to meet this guy, and we had a rather pleasant conversation. He treated me quite kindly, given that I was just a figment of his imagination. I would say he treated me well for a figment. And then, after a while, our conversation was over, so as we left, one of his younger colleagues took me aside and said, you know, we take very good care of Dr. So-and-so, because when he goes, we all go. Well, so much for solipsism. I'm not going to talk about that at all. So I'm going to talk instead about science and religion. The title of my talk is Science and Religion, Where the Conflict Really Lies. And this is part of a longer piece of work I'm working on. There are several different apparent areas or flashpoints, areas of conflict or flashpoints with respect to this conflict, if there is in fact such a conflict. There are several suggestions made as to where there's conflict between religion and science. For example, some people think the idea of divine action in the world, God's acting specially in the world, acting beyond creation and conservation, which would include, for example, miracles, Jesus rising from the dead, but many more things too. I mean, both John Calvin and Thomas Aquinas talk about the way in which the Holy Spirit of God influences us, causes us to see the truth of the great things of the gospel, and those aren't exactly miracles, but they are action beyond creation and conservation. Many people think there is a conflict there. In fact, some theologians think that, and they wonder, now what can we do about that? Another area where there is conflict is scientific scripture scholarship, sometimes called historical biblical criticism, sometimes called higher criticism. Various theories and proposals one finds in that area conflict with important parts of Christian belief. There is what's called the scientific worldview. Some people think that there is this scientific worldview which supports or enforces naturalism, the idea that there's no such person as God or anything like God. Some people find conflict there. And there are other places as well. But I just want to talk about evolutionary theory here. Contemporary evolutionary theory, I want to argue, I want to comment on the question whether or not that's compatible with theistic belief in God. And so what I want to argue, you'll see on the handout there on the first page, I'll argue that contemporary evolutionary theory, thank you. Contemporary evolutionary theory is not incompatible with theistic belief in God. And I want to argue that the main anti-theistic arguments involving evolution together with other premises also fail. So somebody might say first that evolutionary theory just as such is incompatible with belief in God, with theistic belief. Somebody else might say, well, no, that's not quite right, but evolutionary theory together with some obvious truths of one kind or another altogether is incompatible with belief in God. Then I want to argue thirdly that naturalism, the thought that there is no such thing as the God of theistic religion or anything like God, naturalism is an essential element in the whole naturalistic worldview, which is a kind of semi-religion. It's a quasi-religion, or it's like a religion in the sense that it plays one of the most important roles that a religion plays, namely that of answering these fundamental human questions. Where do we come from? What fundamentally is it to be a human being? What's most real in the world? What is our connection? How are we related to the animal kingdom and the rest of God's creation and so on? These questions are ones that are answered by religions, Christianity, but also answered by naturalism. So naturalism, you might think, is a semi-religion. It's not perhaps a religion just as such, as far as I know. You can't get ordained as a minister in naturalism, let's say. I don't know, maybe that's coming, but as far as I know, it hasn't happened yet. But I want to argue that there is then a science and religion, or science quasi-religion conflict, but it's between naturalism and science, and not between theistic religion, Christianity, let's say, and science. All right? So that's the procedure. That's the plan. So first, contemporary evolutionary theory is compatible with belief in God. Evolution covers a multitude of theses. The New Testament says love covers a multitude of sins. Evolution that term covers not necessarily a multitude of sins, but a multitude of theses. First of all, the ancient earth thesis that the earth is maybe 4 billion years old. Who knows exactly how old, but certainly a lot older than, say, was thought in the 18th century. The universe itself is maybe 13 billion years old. So the ancient earth thesis first. Second, the thesis of descent with modification, where the idea is that all the vast variety of flora and fauna, all the vast variety, enormous variety you find in the living world, all came to be by virtue of offspring differing ordinarily in rather small respects from their parents. And these differences proliferate and spread out, and as a result you get this enormous variation that you do find in our contemporary living world. And then Third, there's the common ancestry thesis, the idea that if you pick if you pick any two living creatures, not just any two people, not just any two mammals, but any two living creatures, and trace their ancestry far enough back, you'll run into a common ancestor, right? So we're all cousins, not only us people, but we're cousins with all living things. You and the summer squash in your backyard are cousins under the skin or under the rind, as the case may be. That's the third one. Then the fourth one, Darwinism, in some ways the most important one. Well, I don't know if it's the most important, but the most perhaps discussed one. The claim that the principal mechanism driving this process of descent with modification is natural selection, winnowing or working on random genetic mutation. So you all know how this is supposed to work. These random mutations occur periodically. Most of them are lethal, but some are in fact not merely not lethal, but adaptive. And the creatures to which these mutations accrue, the adaptive ones, if they are also heritable, they leave more offspring than the creatures that don't have the benefit of them. And eventually the change spreads, the whole new genotype spreads to the whole population, and the whole thing can start over again. It's by virtue of this process. Of course, it's not as if it occurs as if there's just one of these going on at a time, so to speak, in a species. There might be many. But by virtue of this process going on over and over and over again, you start from just, say, a single living cell of some kind and wind up with everything you find in the world now, all the living creatures you find, including us human beings. All right? Now, it's pretty clear that when I speak of, I'm going to talk about the compatibility of theistic belief and of Christianity with evolution, with these various theses. When I think of Christianity, I'm thinking of something like the intersection of the great Christian creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, maybe the Catholic Baltimore Creed, Baltimore Catechism, the Heidelberg Catechism, Luther's Small Catechism. All of these creeds, what they have in common, that's sort of, you might call this mere Christianity, the mere Christianity that C.S. Lewis talks about. That's what I'm thinking of when I speak of Christianity. And if you take a look at these four theses, the first three are pretty obviously compatible with that. The ancient earth thesis, lots of Christians don't think the earth is that old, but it's not part of the creeds, part of that of Christianity defined in that fashion, that the earth is, say, only 6,000 years or 10,000 or 100,000 or something like that. They don't make any pronouncements on that. And the same for the next two, the thesis of descent with modification and the common ancestry thesis, where there might be a conflict, or sort of the best place to look for a conflict, the most plausible place to look would be perhaps Darwinism, the idea that what drives this process of descent with modification is natural selection, working on random genetic mutation. So we have to ask this question: is Darwinism incompatible with theistic religion? And a large number of people think so. A very large number of people say that it is. People both way to the left on the theological spectrum and also to the right on the theological spectrum. For example, Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, those are two of the four horsemen of atheism, the new atheists, the four horsemen of atheism, not to be confused with the four horsemen of Notre Dame. That's very different, all right? Maybe most of you are too young even to remember or know about the four horsemen of Notre Dame, but they're very important. And Dawkins and Dennett are two of the four horsemen of atheism, the other two being Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. They all declare that, as a matter of fact, contemporary evolutionary theory is incompatible with Christianity or any theistic religion, incompatible with belief in God, and as a matter of fact, contemporary evolutionary theory has been scientifically established. Therefore, Christian belief is false, in real trouble. All right? But if you just think about it abstractly, it doesn't seem like that's right. I mean, as far as mere Christianity goes, that doesn't say much about how God created the living world. He could have done this in many ways, whatever way it pleased him to do it, really. And if he wanted to, he could have used some process like some kind of Darwinian process involving descent with modification, and where the whole thing is driven by natural selection. God could have done it that way if he'd wanted to. I'm not saying God did do it that way. That's this whole question as to whether theistic evolution is an acceptable way of thinking or is in fact true, but there's no contradiction there. God could certainly have done it that way. He could have caused the right mutations to arise at the right time, for example. He could have protected various species, various groups of animals from various kinds of hazards and dangers. He could have preserved various populations so as to orchestrate the whole process in such a way as to get just the result he wanted. In fact, he wouldn't really be orchestrating it. He would be much more intimately involved in it than that if, as a matter of fact, he caused these mutations. You might say, well, look, these are supposed to be random genetic mutations. Could they both be random and caused by God? But there, the right answer, it seems to me, is that randomness here doesn't mean uncaused, doesn't mean unforeseen by God, also doesn't mean uncaused by God. It just means that there isn't any causal connection between, on the one hand, what a given creature needs with respect to its environment to be adapted properly to its environment, and the genetic mutations that accrue to it. That's what it means, and that's perfectly compatible with God's causing these genetic mutations. Now, where would we think that there would be a conflict here? Well, it would be with respect to this claim on the part of Christianity and other theistic religions too, that God has created human beings, created them in his image. He created them in his image. He wanted them to be a certain way. He intended that there be creatures of a certain kind. And then he acted in such a way as to bring it about that there be creatures of that kind. Maybe creatures who have knowledge and have a moral sense, can tell right from wrong, and who can stand in some kind of personal relationship with God himself, all right? I mean, maybe that's a certain way of cashing out the notion of image of God. There are other ways too, but maybe that's one way to think about it. But the point is, God would then have guided and orchestrated this whole process with a certain end in mind. He wanted there to be a certain kinds of creatures. And it's that which some people, many people, the ones I just mentioned and others, it's that these people think is incompatible with evolutionary theory. What's not consistent with Christian belief is the claim that evolution and Darwinism are unguided. So that's what's not compatible with Christian belief. If we have in fact come to be by virtue of evolution, by way of evolution, then it would have been by God's guiding this whole process, directing it, orchestrating it. Okay? So what's not consistent with Christian belief is the claim that evolution and Darwinism are unguided. But there are a whole choir of distinguished experts that tell us exactly that evolution is unguided. So, for example, here's George Gaylord Simpson. Man, and no doubt woman as well, I mean, I interpolated that, he didn't say that. I guess we could think about that. Could it be that man is a result of a purposeless natural process that didn't have him in mind, but not so for women, you know? Nobody, as far as I know, has written a dissertation on that question, but let me recommend it to you, all right? So he says, man, and no doubt woman, I'd say no doubt woman as well, is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Stephen Jay Gould says, if the evolutionary tape were to be rewound and then let go forward again, the chances are we'd get creatures of a very different sort. Maybe we wouldn't get anything at all like Homo sapiens. Maybe we'd only get bacteria. Well, that's incompatible, again, with the idea that if we have come to be by way of evolution, then it's by way of guided evolution. And here's how Richard Dawkins puts it. I would say he's probably the primary. There are these four horsemen of atheism. He's the primary horseman. All right? So here's what he says. All appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. A true watchmaker has foresight. He designs his cogs and springs and plans their interconnections with a future purpose in his mind's eye. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life. Note that phrase, as we now know. I mean, someone has in fact spoken of as we now know-ism, as we now know-ism. You find this phrase repeated over and over again by people who are claiming that what people knew in the past didn't amount to much, you know. Now we know a whole lot of things. We know much better what other people didn't know, our ancestors, let's say our parents, grandparents, and so on, as we now know, and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. And in fact, the subtitle of his book, what the book is supposed to show us, is Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. So a central claim of the whole book is just that the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design. Okay, now in this book, Dawkins really does three things. First, he recounts some of the fascinating anatomical details of certain living creatures and their ways. And he's very good at that. He's a terrific science writer. So he talks in the book, I remember he talks about bats and the way in which bats, by virtue of their sonar, bats have sonar. They send out sound waves and receive them and can navigate by virtue of that. They can navigate through a completely dark, pitch black, dark cave full of stalactites that hang down from the ceiling and stalagmites that go up from the floor, or maybe vice versa, doesn't matter. And they can navigate through such a maze at an enormously high rate of speed and never touching one of them by virtue of this sonar. And he describes how this goes in elaborate detail. It's very interesting and very good. Second, Dawkins in the book tries to refute arguments for the conclusion that blind, unguided evolution could not have produced certain of the wonders of the living world. So going all the way back to Darwin's own time, there were people like St. George Mivart, for example, who claimed that various kinds of structures that you'll find and various kinds of features of animals and plants in the living world could not have come to be by virtue of unguided evolution. His favorite example was the eye, where you've got an astonishing array of interconnected features of the eye, structures that all have to, if they were to develop by way of unguided evolution, they'd all have to make advances at the same time along very many different fronts, so to speak. It could be that an advance along one front wouldn't make vision any better, but could do so only in the context of advances along other fronts, modifications to other different parts of the eye. Michael Behe has talked about irreducible complexity, and it's the very same idea that you find in St. George Mivart back in Darwin's time. Well, one of the things that Dawkins does is to try to show that these arguments don't really work. And sometimes he's reasonably successful, and other times seems to me he's not very successful at all. And then third, he makes suggestions. One thing is to refute these claims as to how it couldn't happen. Another thing is he does thirdly is to make suggestions as to how it did in fact happen, how it could be that these and other organic systems have developed by unguided evolution. But the principal form of argument for the conclusion, the basic conclusion here, is that evolution reveals a universe without design. The form of argument for that conclusion, the main argument, goes, as far as I can make out in that book, like this. If you look on the sheet there, 1 and 2. The premise, we know of no irrefutable objections to its being biologically possible that all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes. All right? That's the premise. Therefore, here's the conclusion, all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes. All right? If you think about that argument, I mean, you'll see that it's really a pretty lousy argument, right? In fact, that's putting it mildly. It is a horrifyingly lousy argument. Lots of philosophers give unsound arguments, and I've given a few of my own. Tom Crisp never has, but most of us have. But very few arguments that anybody I know of has given have that display the distance between premise and conclusion of this argument. It basically goes like, it hasn't been proven impossible, therefore it's true. It hasn't been proven. So, for example, suppose last year I'd come to the chairman of the philosophy department and said, the president wants me to receive a $50,000 a year raise. Well, naturally, the chairman might want to, why I thought that was true, He said, really? What makes you think that's true? I say, nobody has proven it impossible. It's not going to get anywhere, right? It's an unusually bad argument as far as I can make out. So Dawkins utterly fails to show that the facts of evolution reveal a universe without design. He doesn't show any such thing at all. At best, he shows that nobody's proved that's impossible. But still, the fact that he and other experts, like the ones I mentioned in the preceding page, assert his subtitle, that evolution reveals a universe without design, loudly and slowly, as it were. If you're talking to someone whom you think is mentally challenged, a bit mentally challenged, maybe because they've got a hangover, let's say, or some reason like that, you talk to them loudly and slowly, right? So the fact that these people do that can be expected to convince many that the biological theory of evolution is, in fact, incompatible with a theistic belief that the living world has been designed. Well, what about the fact that the relevant genetic mutations are said to be random? I commented on that just a bit ago here. But here are a couple of quotations that are specifically addressed to this by people who should know, if anybody does. Ernst Mayr says, when it's said that mutation or variation is random, the statement simply means that there is no correlation between the production of new genotypes and the adaptational needs of an organism in a given environment. And Elliot Sober perhaps puts this point even better. Elliot Sober is a very eminent contemporary philosopher of biology. He says, there is no physical mechanism, either inside organisms or outside of them, that detects which mutations would be beneficial and then causes those mutations to occur. Well, I mean, if these genetic mutations are random in that sense, that's perfectly compatible with their having been caused by God. So the point is that a mutation accruing to an organism is random just if neither the organism nor its environment contains such a mechanism. Okay, so as far as I can see, the claim that evolution demonstrates that human beings and other living creatures have not, contrary to appearances, I mean, they certainly look designed, have not, contrary to appearances, been designed. That's not a part or a consequence of the scientific theory of evolution just as such. That is what you might call a metaphysical or theological add-on. The theory just as such is not a theory of guided evolution, certainly, but it's also not a theory of unguided evolution. As a scientific theory, it doesn't address such questions as whether or not evolution has been guided by God, for example. Science typically doesn't address questions of that sort. If you study physics, you'll learn about natural laws of various kinds, say Newton's laws, but there isn't any further comment in the science as to whether or not these laws were put for the universe by God or happened by chance or something of that sort. That's typically not part of science at all. So it looks to me that the claim on the part of all of these people that the theory of evolution just as such, the scientific theory, includes unguidedness, it looks to me like that's a metaphysical or a theological add-on. That's what these people believe themselves, but it's not part of the theory just as such. But that's not completely obvious, I'd have to admit. Not completely obvious about the scientific theory as such. After all, if you think about it, how do you find out exactly what some scientific theory says? In the case of the theory of evolution, it's not that you can go to Washington, D.C. and find somewhere, maybe emblazoned on the walls of the Academy for the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, let's say, an axiomatic formulation of the theory of evolution. That's not how it works. You've got lots of different people saying lots of different things. How do you tell then what is the scientific theory of evolution? That's not so obvious. And there are confusions here. So, for example, Pope John Paul II, and since I taught at Notre Dame, I'm interested in popes and what they think. Pope John Paul II, he seemed favorably disposed towards evolution. He said it was more than a theory. It's not just a mere theory. It's better than that, right? On the other hand, Cardinal Schoenborn, important Catholic cardinal, said, evolution in the sense of common ancestry might be true, but evolution in the neo-Darwinian sense, an unguided, unplanned process of random variation and natural selection, is not, all right? There seems to be a kind of, the Pope and the Cardinal don't seem to be on the same page there. In the Catholic Church, the Cardinals are supposed to stay on the same page as the Pope, but occasionally they stray, all right? And in this case, I think they don't understand evolution in just the same way. Furthermore, as lots of polls reveal, most Americans have really grave doubts about the truth of evolution. I don't know just what the figures are, and they change from time to time, and it depends on which poll you take a look at. But in many polls, fewer than half of Americans believe in evolution, and some of them fewer than a quarter of Americans believe in evolution. And you might wonder why that is. Lots of Americans have grave doubts. Lots of Christians are concerned about the teaching of evolution in the schools. Lots of Christians want something added as a kind of corrective, maybe ID or some other kind of corrective, or they want evolution taught as a mere theory rather than as a sober truth, or they want objections to it to be taught along with the evolutionary theory itself and the like. Well, why is this? I think the reason why this is that we are regularly told by the experts, Dawkins, Dennett, Gould, Simpson, Ayala, and others, that current scientific evolutionary theory asserts or implies that the living world is not designed and that the whole evolutionary process is unguided. When the experts tell us this over and over again. The National Association of Biology Teachers until 10 years ago officially described evolution as, on their website, they described it as an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process. Unsupervised, impersonal, not supervised, not orchestrated by God or anyone else. Okay? If we're regularly told by the experts that in fact the theory is a theory of unguided evolution, it's no wonder that many Christians believe that. The experts are, after all, experts. And if they do believe it, then it's not surprising that they don't want it to be taught as a sober truth in public schools. Understood in that way, it's incompatible with Christian as well as Jewish and Muslim belief. Clearly, there are questions of justice here. Would it be just to teach in public schools positions that go contrary to the religious beliefs of most of those who pay for those schools? The answer seems to me fairly clear. That would not be just. That would not be proper. And therefore, in a way, these people like Dawkins, Dennett, Ayala, and the rest, who trumpet the incompatibility of current evolutionary theory with religious belief, with Christian belief, as far as that goes, with Jewish and Muslim belief as well. In a way, they're doing science a real disservice, because most Americans are, in fact, believers in God. Again, polls vary, but maybe as many as 80%. And very many of them are very serious about believing in God. Very many of them, for very many, that's the sort of linchpin of their whole way of thinking. And if, in fact, something like evolution is incompatible with that, they're just going to be very suspicious of evolution. If they're told evolution by the experts, the ones who ought to know that there is that incompatibility, what's more natural than for them to be inclined to reject it, to be at best very suspicious of it, to think it should not be taught as a sober truth in schools they pay for, and the like. Okay, well, so much for that topic. Now I'm going to skip the next bit here, section 2, broader anti-theistic arguments from evolution, and go to section 3, naturalism against evolution. Tom, how much time do I have? What's a natural thing? Who's the boss here?
You have till 11:30 or beyond.
Okay. But of course we want to have questions, right? So we don't want me to, yeah. Okay, now if you return to the first page, I said I wanted to argue that there is a science religion or quasi-science, quasi-religion conflict, all right, but it's a conflict between naturalism and science, not between theistic religion and science. And that's what section 3 is about. I want to argue that, in fact, there is conflict between naturalism and evolution, despite the fact that evolution is often thought of as a sort of supporting pillar in the temple of naturalism. There is, in fact, I believe, and the longer I think about this argument, the more firmly I'm convinced that it's correct. Of course, I could be wrong, but I'm not. Right, of course, right. There is, in fact, a conflict. It's not that it's logically impossible that they both be true, not that kind of conflict. They could both be true. It's rather that one can't sensibly believe them both. Maybe sensibly one could sensibly believe evolution. Maybe one could sensibly believe naturalism. I don't think so myself, but maybe. But you can't sensibly believe the two together. So here, I'm going to use the letter N as an abbreviation for naturalism, and E as an abbreviation for the thought that we human beings and all of our faculties and parts have come to be by virtue of the processes pointed out or mentioned in current evolutionary theory. And R is the proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable. Here, by cognitive faculties, I just mean things like memory and perception. That's a cognitive faculty. Memory and perception provide us with beliefs, you might say. I look out and I see people. I can't see them very well because of these miserable lights, but there's people out there. I perceive them. I form that belief by virtue of a certain kind of experience. That belief arises in me. There are people in front of me here. The same goes, another cognitive faculty is that of logical or a priori intuition. You might call it rational intuition, whereby you can see the truth of simple mathematical propositions, 2 + 1 = 3, let's say, and the validity of certain forms of logical arguments, say modus ponens, if A implies B, and furthermore A is true, then B's got to be true too. You can just see that these things are so. That's by virtue of what you might call a rational intuition. There are still other faculties. Thomas Reid spoke of sympathy, whereby you can tell what somebody else is thinking and feeling. I mean, you don't go through an argument from the way their body looks to the conclusion the person is thinking or feeling something. You can tell just by taking a look very often. I mean, I can take a look at my wife and see that I've done something wrong. And so there are these cognitive faculties. For them to be reliable is for them to produce in us, for the most part, true beliefs, all right? Not 100%, though they don't have to be 100% reliable to be reliable, but maybe like And it would, of course, vary from area to area what reliability would consist in. But as a general overall figure, maybe 3 out of 4 beliefs have to be true for the whole battery of cognitive faculties to be reliable, something like that. We could break it down into individual faculties if we like and say a whole lot more here, but I won't. Okay, so then we've got premise 1. The probability of R's being true, the probability of R, given N and E, assuming N and E are true, that's low, all right? Now, maybe not all of you are acquainted with that kind of symbolism. I'll bet you not nearly all of you are. But I think everybody's acquainted with the idea there, the idea of conditional probability, the probability of one proposition conditional on the assumption of the truth of some other proposition, all right? So, for example, you might ask, what's the probability that Mr. A will live to be 70, given that he's now 35, smokes, eats way too much and is grossly overweight, never exercises, spends all his time watching television, and has grandparents, all of whom died by the age of 50. That's a low probability, right? Very likely he's not going to wind up get to be 70. On the other hand, you might say, well, what's the probability that Mr. B will wind up to be 70, will live to be 70, given that Mr. B is now 65, runs 11 miles every day, is trim and fit, watches his diet like a hawk, and has grandparents, all of whom live to be over 100. That'll be a much higher probability, right? So the probability of one proposition given some other proposition on the condition that some other proposition, hence conditional probability. What's the probability that Jock, who lives in Glasgow, Scotland, is a Mormon? What's the probability that Jock is a Mormon given that he lives in Glasgow, Scotland? Pretty low. There aren't that many Mormons in Glasgow or in Scotland as a whole. What's the probability that Brigham is a Mormon given that Brigham lives in Salt Lake City? Well, that's going to be much higher, right? So you got the idea, conditional probability. Now the question here with respect to 1 is, what's the conditional probability of the proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable, that is R, given that, or on the condition that naturalism and evolution are true, that naturalism is true and our faculties have come to be by virtue of the sort of evolution that we learn about in school. Okay, that's the first premise. The second premise is, if you accept N and E, so you believe N and E, and you also see that 1 is true, then you have a defeater for your belief in R. We all believe instinctively, automatically, normally, that our cognitive faculties are reliable, at least for the most part. But I say, if you believe N and E and you see that 1 is true, then you've got a defeater for that belief, for the belief that your faculties are reliable, where a defeater for a belief is some other belief you acquire, such that as long as you hold the second belief, you can no longer rationally accept the first. Let me give an example. Suppose I'm visiting Aberdeen, Scotland, and I've got this guidebook which tells me that King's College Chapel, which is King's College is part of the University of Aberdeen, was founded. That King's College, let's say that King's College was founded in 1596. Well, I'll naturally believe that, right? It's a guidebook, so I believe that's when it was founded. Then the next day I go to a party where I meet the author of the guidebook, and he says the bane of his existence, the saddest thing that has ever happened to him, a millstone around his neck, is that he got that figure wrong. It wasn't 1596, it was 1496. His life has never been the same since. His wife divorced him. The bank foreclosed on his house. Everything went downhill from there, right? Well, then I will no longer believe the first thing I believed. Instead, I will no longer believe that. Instead, I'll believe it was established at the time he said. So I got a defeater there, a defeater for my original belief that the college was founded in 1596. Okay? Then the next premise is one who has a defeater for R for the proposition that one's cognitive faculties are reliable, has a defeater for any belief she takes to be produced by her cognitive faculties. And of course, that would be all of her beliefs, right? One's beliefs are produced by one's cognitive faculties. That's where they come from. That's the only place they come from, all right? So I say one then who has a defeater for R, that her faculties are reliable, then gets a defeater for any belief produced by her cognitive faculties. And of course, one of those beliefs is N and E itself, right? I mean, think about it. If you get a defeater for the belief that a certain encyclopedia is reliable, then you get a defeater so far for any belief you got by virtue of consulting that encyclopedia, right? So here too, if you have a defeater for the proposition that your faculties are reliable, then you get a defeater for any belief that you think is produced by your faculties, which of course is all of your faculties. And hence, if you believe N and R, N and E, you've now got a defeater for N and E, right? Well, then it looks as if N and E is self-defeating. It provides a defeater for itself. It shoots itself in the foot. It is self-referentially incoherent. And we could call it other names as well, but the bottom line would be that it's not rationally acceptable. You can't rationally accept it. You can't sensibly believe both N and E. As I say, maybe as far as this argument goes, one of them and maybe the other, but not their conjunction, all right? Well, now there's a whole lot to be said about these premises. Quite a lot has in fact been said about them. Some things that have been said about them have been said by Tom, for example, and others. But I want to give it a sort of an argument for the first premise, and I'll let it go at that so that we'll have a little time for discussion. The first premise, the probability of R given N and E is low. Now, let's take naturalism to include materialism about human beings. If you're a materialist about human beings, then you think that human beings are through and through material objects. They don't have any immaterial aspect or immaterial part, no immaterial soul or self or ego, nothing of the sort, say, Augustine thought, or Aquinas or Descartes. A human being is just made of meat all the way through, all right? And I want to annex that to naturalism because, as a matter of fact, almost all naturalists, at least the ones I know, believe that, okay? Well, if you ask yourself then, from this point of view, what sort of thing will a belief be? So we've got beliefs, everybody's got beliefs. What sort of thing is a belief? Is it animal, vegetable, mineral? What sort of thing is a belief from the perspective of materialism? And the answer is that it's hard to see what it could be, except for it, I mean, the only thing it could be really is a kind of event or structure in one's nervous system, maybe in one's brain, all right? It'll be something like a bunch of neurons working together, clicking away, sending signals, receiving signals, various rates of fire in various parts of the structure, and the like of that. Okay. Well, now, instead of thinking about ourselves, I suggest, let's think about a population of creatures on some distant planet. Maybe now some people talk about there being all these alternative universes, many universes, all right? Maybe in some other universe then. And suppose that N and E holds for them. So suppose N and E holds for them, all right? Now we want to ask, what's the probability of R with respect to N and E for those creatures? What we can assume about these creatures is that their behavior is adaptive. We're assuming E, that evolution, they came to be by way of evolution, so their behavior is adaptive to their present circumstances, or maybe it's adaptive with respect to the circumstances of their forebears, but their behavior is adaptive, conducive to survival and reproduction. This behavior is caused by processes in their brains, so you might say, well, now why is it that my arm rises? Well, it's because certain signals were sent from one part of my brain through a chain of nerves, through a chain of neurons, which would be a nerve of some kind, an effector nerve, causing a certain muscle to contract, and up goes my arm, all right? So this behavior is caused by processes in their brains, which we could call the underlying neurology. That neurology, therefore, is also adaptive. The underlying neurology would be all the structures in one's brain, and the way in which those things work is also adaptive in that it causes adaptive behavior. Now, neurology, this underlying neurology, furthermore, also brings it about that they have certain beliefs, that these creatures have certain beliefs, okay? So the underlying neurology both causes action of a certain kind and also, you might say, supports belief, causes belief, brings it about that these neural structures have a certain content. But as far as that adaptive behavior is concerned, the adaptive behavior which is caused by the neurology, it doesn't matter whether those beliefs which are also caused by that neurology are true or false. It doesn't make any difference. As long as the underlying neurology causes the right kind of actions, it doesn't matter what kind of belief content it also causes. Could be anything. Imagine a frog sitting on a lily pond. A fly buzzes by, the frog's tongue flicks out, captures the fly. This is a good thing from the frog's point of view, not so good from the fly's point of view, but it contributes to the survival and reproductive fitness of the frog, okay? And what counts there is that this underlying neurology somehow monitors the approach of the fly and causes the frog's tongue to flick out at the appropriate moment, right? Now, maybe that underlying neurology also causes belief on the part of the frog. Maybe the frog thinks, if some princess came along and kissed me, I would turn into a prince. Who knows what this frog thinks? The point is, it doesn't matter. If it does have beliefs, maybe it doesn't, but if it does have beliefs, it doesn't matter if those beliefs are true or false, as long as the underlying neurology causes the right kind of action, causes adaptive action, okay? So I say, as far as that adaptive behavior is concerned, it doesn't matter whether those beliefs are true or false. If true, fine. If false, also fine. Either way, the underlying neurology causes adaptive behavior. But then it doesn't matter whether their beliefs are for the most part true or for the most part false, or half true and half false. So take any particular belief on the part of these creatures we're thinking about on this other planet. What's the probability that it's true? Well, you'd have to say it could be true, it could be false. No more reason to think it true than false. You'd have to say it's about a half. But then the probability of R for these creatures is low. If you've got, say, 100 beliefs, then the probability with respect to each one of them that it's true is a half. Then the probability, say, that 3/4 of them are true, which might be a figure you could choose for reliability, will be extremely low. It'll be less than one out of a million, all right? So then the probability of R for these creatures is really low. That is, the probability of N and E with respect to them is really low. And of course, the same thing really goes for us. And that's the argument for premise one. And I'll stop there so that there's time for questions. Right.